The fall of the Vandals is the tragedy of a warrior tribe that marched from the deep forests of Eastern Europe, crossed the entire continent, and ultimately conquered the city of Rome itself. Their name became a byword in history for senseless destruction, but the truth is that they were the builders of a formidable maritime kingdom in North Africa, one that controlled the Mediterranean Sea. From a stunning triumph at Carthage to a brutal assault on the very heart of the Roman Empire, this is their story. Who were they? Here is how the Vandals fell, undone by nothing less than a devastating counterstrike from the Byzantine Empire, which returned to erase their name from the map of the world forever. The Vandals originated as a Germanic tribal people whose earliest documented homeland lay in the region of what is now Poland and the border areas of the Czech Republic and Germany, part of the broader family of Germanic-speaking peoples whose migrations and territorial expansions would fundamentally reshape the political map of late antique Europe over the course of several centuries of sustained demographic and political transformation. The specific catalyst that set the Vandals on their historic journey westward and eventually southward toward the Mediterranean world was the arrival of the Huns, the fearsome steppe nomadic confederation whose own westward migration this broader podcast series has previously examined in considerable detail, whose sudden and overwhelming military pressure against various Germanic and other European peoples during the late 4th century AD set off a cascading series of population displacements that historians collectively refer to as the migration period, one of the most historically significant and disruptive demographic transformations in the entire history of ancient and late antique Europe. The Vandals, pressed by this mounting Hunnic pressure and by the shifting alliances and conflicts among neighbouring Germanic peoples that this pressure generated, began a westward migration that would eventually carry them across the entire European continent. A journey involving genuine and sustained hardship, periodic military conflict with other displaced peoples, and with Roman frontier forces, and the kind of collective determination and adaptability that would characterize Vandal historical experience throughout the following decades of their remarkable and historically unprecedented migration. The famous crossing of the Rhine River on the last day of the year 406 AD represents one of the most historically significant and symbolically resonant moments in the entire history of the Western Roman Empire's gradual collapse, as the Vandals, travelling in coalition with other Germanic peoples, including the Alans and Suebi, crossed this crucial river frontier during winter conditions that had frozen the river sufficiently to allow crossing, entering Roman Gaul in a movement that Roman frontier defences proved unable to prevent or effectively contain, marking a genuinely pivotal moment in the broader collapse of effective Roman frontier control throughout Western Europe. The subsequent Vandal presence within Roman Gaul involved a difficult and often violent period of continued migration, foraging, and periodic conflict with both Roman forces and rival Germanic and other peoples competing for the same limited resources and territory throughout this politically fragmented and increasingly chaotic frontier region, a genuinely difficult survival struggle that tested the Vandal people's collective resilience and adaptability during this crucial formative period of their historical journey toward the Mediterranean world and their eventual establishment of an independent kingdom. The specific tribal organization of the Vandals during this early migration period appears to have included at least two distinct subgroups, generally identified by modern historians as the Hasdingi and Silingi Vandals, each maintaining somewhat distinct leadership structures and historical traditions even as they moved together through this shared migration experience, with the Hasdingi branch eventually providing the royal dynasty, including Gaiseric himself, that would lead the Vandal people through their subsequent conquests and the establishment of their eventual North African kingdom. Roman contemporary accounts of this period while inevitably filtered through Roman cultural perspectives that generally characterized migrating Germanic peoples as dangerous and culturally inferior barbarians, nonetheless provide valuable, if limited, historical documentation of the genuine scale and disruptive impact that this Vandal migration, occurring alongside the broader wave of Germanic and other peoples' movements during this same tumultuous period, had upon Roman frontier security and the broader stability of Western Roman imperial administration throughout Gaul and the surrounding territories during these crucial early years of the 5th century AD. Following their difficult passage through Gaul discussed in the previous episode, the Vandals continued their migration southward into the Iberian Peninsula, the region comprising modern Spain and Portugal, arriving in this territory around 409 AD and beginning a new phase of their historical journey that would eventually, after considerable further conflict and negotiation, bring them to the shores of North Africa. The Iberian Peninsula that the Vandals entered was itself a politically contested and fragmented territory, with various Germanic peoples including the Suebi and Visigoths, alongside remaining Roman provincial authorities and local populations, all competing for territorial control and political influence throughout this region during this broadly chaotic period of Western Roman imperial decline, creating a genuinely complex political landscape that the Vandals had to navigate through a combination of military conflict, strategic alliance, and periodic negotiated settlement with Roman authorities. The specific relationship between the Vandals and Roman imperial authority during this Iberian period fluctuated considerably, with periods of formal treaty relationship in which the Vandals received recognized status as settled federates within Roman territory, alternating with periods of renewed conflict as the practical balance of military power and territorial control shifted between these various competing parties throughout this extended and genuinely unstable period of Iberian political history. The decision to cross the Mediterranean Sea into North Africa, achieved under the leadership of King Gaiseric beginning in 429 AD, represents one of the most historically consequential strategic decisions in the entire Vandal historical narrative, as this move took the Vandal people away from the increasingly crowded and contested European mainland toward territory that, while still nominally under Roman imperial administration, offered genuine strategic and economic opportunities that the increasingly fragmented and contested European territories could no longer adequately provide for the Vandal people's continued security and prosperity. King Gaiseric, whose leadership would prove absolutely decisive in transforming the Vandals from a migrating and militarily vulnerable tribal people into the rulers of a genuinely significant and historically consequential Mediterranean kingdom, emerges in the historical record as a figure of exceptional political and military skill, combining genuine tactical military capability with sophisticated diplomatic judgment that would allow the Vandals to successfully navigate the complex and often treacherous political landscape of the late Roman Mediterranean world throughout the following decades of his remarkably long and historically significant reign. The specific circumstances that led Gaiseric to organize this historically significant Mediterranean crossing involved a combination of practical strategic calculation and, according to certain historical accounts, an invitation, or at least tacit encouragement, from a Roman provincial official named Bonifacius, who was engaged in his own political conflict with rival Roman authorities and may have viewed Vandal military assistance as a potentially valuable resource for his own political struggles, illustrating the genuinely complex and often self-interested political calculations that characterized relationships between various Roman provincial authorities and the Germanic peoples whose military capability increasingly represented significant potential resources within the broader context of Western Roman imperial political fragmentation during this turbulent period. The logistical achievement that this Mediterranean crossing represented deserves particular historical appreciation, as transporting a substantial population, including non-combatant women, children, and elderly individuals alongside Vandal warriors and their equipment, across a genuinely significant maritime distance, using vessels and navigational expertise that this fundamentally land-based Germanic people had to develop or acquire specifically for this purpose, represents a genuinely impressive organizational and logistical accomplishment that speaks directly to Geiseric's demonstrated leadership capability and the broader Vandal people's genuine adaptability in confronting entirely unfamiliar practical and strategic challenges throughout this crucial phase of their historical migration. The Vandal conquest of North Africa, culminating in the capture of the historically significant city of Carthage in 439 AD, represents one of the most historically consequential territorial conquests of the entire late Roman period, establishing Vandal political control over one of the Western Roman Empire's most economically productive and strategically important provincial territories. Following their initial landing in North Africa, Vandal forces under Geiseric's leadership systematically overcame Roman provincial defensive forces, whose military capability had already been substantially weakened by the broader crisis of Western Roman imperial military resources during this period of sustained frontier pressure across multiple simultaneous fronts throughout the empire's vast and increasingly difficult-to-defend territorial holdings, allowing Vandal forces to progressively extend their territorial control across the North African provinces despite Roman efforts to organize effective resistance. The specific capture of Carthage itself, achieved through what appears to have been a combination of military pressure and, according to some historical accounts, an element of surprise or deception that allowed Vandal forces to enter the city before its defenders could organize fully effective resistance, represented an enormously significant strategic and economic achievement, as Carthage stood as one of the largest, wealthiest, and most strategically positioned cities in the entire Western Mediterranean world, its capture providing the Vandals with an economically productive and defensively formidable base from which to establish their new kingdom. This conquest effectively ended nearly 6 centuries of Roman political control over this North African territory, a region that had served as one of the Roman Empire's most economically vital agricultural provinces, particularly for grain production that had long helped feed the population of Rome itself, meaning that Vandal conquest of this territory represented not merely a symbolic loss, but a genuine and economically significant blow to the broader Western Roman imperial system's practical capacity to sustain its own population and administrative structure throughout the following decades of continued Western Roman imperial decline. The establishment of Carthage as the new Vandal royal capital marked the definitive transformation of the Vandal people from a migrating tribal confederation into a genuinely settled territorial kingdom, with Gaiseric and his successors developing increasingly sophisticated administrative structures for governing this newly conquered territory and its substantial existing Romanized population, a population that would need to be governed and, to whatever extent proved politically necessary and practically achievable, integrated into the new Vandal political and social order throughout the following decades of Vandal kingdom consolidation and development. The specific process through which Gaiseric consolidated his authority over the broader North African provincial territory beyond Carthage itself involved a combination of continued military pressure against remaining pockets of Roman resistance and, in various documented instances, negotiated settlements with local provincial authorities and landowning elites who recognized the practical reality of Vandal military dominance and chose accommodation over continued and increasingly hopeless resistance, a pattern of conquest and consolidation that allowed Vandal authority to extend across the broader North African provincial territory more efficiently than sustained military conflict alone could likely have achieved. Roman imperial authorities, both in the remaining Western Roman court and in Constantinople, initially responded to this North African conquest with genuine alarm given the territory's substantial economic and strategic significance, leading to several diplomatic and, on at least one occasion, direct military efforts to reverse or at least limit this Vandal territorial achievement. Though these Roman responses ultimately proved unable to dislodge Gaisaric's now firmly established North African kingdom, with a formal treaty eventually recognizing Vandal control over this territory, providing at least temporary diplomatic stability to this genuinely significant new political reality throughout the Western Mediterranean world. Beyond their significant territorial conquest of North Africa, discussed in the previous episode, the Vandals under Gaisaric's leadership developed a genuinely formidable naval capability that would establish their kingdom as a dominant Mediterranean maritime power, controlling crucial sea trade routes and projecting military force throughout the Western Mediterranean basin for several decades of sustained naval prominence. This Vandal naval development represented a genuinely remarkable achievement for a people whose origins lay in the landlocked forests of Central Europe, with no traditional maritime culture or naval expertise comparable to established Mediterranean seafaring peoples, illustrating the genuine adaptability and strategic flexibility that characterized Vandal political and military development under Gaisaric's particularly capable leadership throughout this crucial period of their kingdom's establishment and consolidation. Vandal naval forces conducted extensive raiding operations throughout the Western Mediterranean, targeting the coastal territories and islands of the remaining Western Roman Empire and extracting substantial wealth and resources through these naval campaigns, while also extending direct Vandal political control over strategically and economically significant islands, including Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands, creating a genuinely extensive maritime kingdom that controlled crucial Mediterranean trade and communication routes throughout the height of Vandal naval power. The specific tactical and strategic approach that Vandal naval forces employed combined direct amphibious assault capability with broader strategic use of naval mobility to strike quickly at vulnerable coastal targets before organized defensive response could be effectively mobilized. A tactical approach broadly comparable to the mobile hit-and-run tactics that various land-based warrior peoples this broader podcast series has examined, employed in terrestrial warfare, adapted successfully to the specific strategic possibilities that naval mobility provided throughout the Mediterranean basin. This Vandal naval dominance generated genuine and widespread fear throughout the remaining Western Roman territories and populations, as coastal communities throughout the Western Mediterranean faced the constant and genuinely unpredictable threat of Vandal naval raids, contributing significantly to the broader atmosphere of insecurity and administrative breakdown that characterized the final decades of independent Western Roman imperial political existence, with Vandal naval power representing one of the most immediately threatening and practically consequential military challenges that the increasingly weakened Western Roman imperial system faced during this critical period of terminal decline. The specific technical and organizational development that allowed the Vandals to build and maintain an effective naval force deserves particular historical attention, since this achievement required not merely the physical construction of ships, but the development of genuine naval expertise, including navigation, ship maintenance, and naval tactical doctrine that this originally land-based Germanic people had to acquire, likely through some combination of captured Roman naval expertise, local North African maritime knowledge inherited from the region's long-established seafaring traditions, and the kind of practical trial-and-error learning that any people confronting genuinely unfamiliar strategic challenges must undertake when circumstances demand rapid adaptation to entirely new forms of military and economic activity. The economic dimension of Vandal naval power extended well beyond simple raiding and plunder to include genuine control over legitimate Mediterranean commercial shipping routes, with Vandal authorities extracting tribute and taxation from merchant vessels operating throughout their controlled maritime territory, creating a sustained and genuinely significant revenue stream that supplemented the more dramatic but ultimately less economically sustainable practice of direct raiding and plunder, illustrating a genuinely sophisticated approach to maritime power that combined military capability with practical economic administration throughout the height of Vandal naval dominance in the western Mediterranean basin. The Vandal assault on Rome itself in 455 AD represents the single most historically famous and culturally consequential event in the entire Vandal historical narrative, an event whose lasting cultural impact would eventually contribute the very term vandalism to subsequent European languages as a general designation for senseless and destructive behavior, despite the considerably more complex and, in various respects, more calculated historical reality of this specific military campaign. The specific circumstances that precipitated this attack involved complex diplomatic and dynastic politics surrounding the Western Roman imperial succession, with Gaiseric apparently perceiving that recent political developments in Rome, including the death of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III and the subsequent political turmoil surrounding his succession, violated previous diplomatic agreements and arrangements between the Vandal kingdom and Roman imperial authority, providing Gaiseric with what he considered legitimate political and diplomatic justification for launching this significant military campaign against the city of Rome itself. The actual Vandal occupation of Rome, extending across approximately 2 weeks during the summer of 455 AD, involved systematic looting of the city's accumulated wealth, including valuable objects from both public and private buildings, and notably, treasures that had themselves been previously looted from the temple in Jerusalem by earlier Roman forces centuries before, illustrating the genuinely long historical chain of conquest and appropriation that characterized the movement of valuable historical treasures throughout the ancient and late antique Mediterranean world. Contemporary and near-contemporary historical accounts, while certainly documenting genuine destruction and violence during this Vandal occupation of Rome, also suggest that Vandal forces exercised somewhat more restraint and organizational discipline than the later popular reputation for senseless vandalism might suggest, with some accounts indicating that Pope Leo I successfully negotiated certain limitations on the scope of Vandal violence and destruction, though the general scale of looting and the genuine trauma that this event represented for Roman civic pride and imperial prestige remained substantial regardless of these specific limitations on the campaign's ultimate scope and severity. The immense wealth that Vandal forces extracted from this campaign, transported back to their North African capital at Carthage, provided substantial economic resources that would help fund the continued development and consolidation of the Vandal kingdom throughout the following decades, while the sheer symbolic significance of successfully sacking Rome itself, a city that had not fallen to a foreign conqueror in this manner for many previous centuries, cemented Gaiseric's reputation as one of the most historically significant and, from the Roman perspective, genuinely feared political and military leaders of this entire tumultuous period of Western Roman imperial collapse. The specific captives that Vandal forces brought back to Carthage following this campaign included members of the Roman imperial family itself. Most significantly, the Empress Eudoxia and her daughters, whose subsequent fate involved complex dynastic marriage politics, including the eventual marriage of one imperial princess to Gaiseric's own son Huneric, illustrating how this military campaign generated not merely immediate material wealth, but also longer-term dynastic and political opportunities that Gaiseric skillfully exploited to further enhance Vandal kingdom prestige and political legitimacy within the broader context of late Roman Mediterranean dynastic politics. The broader psychological and political impact that this second sack of Rome, following the earlier and similarly historically significant Visigothic sack of the city under Alaric in 410 AD, had upon Roman civic and imperial confidence proved genuinely profound, with contemporary Roman writers expressing genuine anguish and theological questioning regarding how such catastrophic events could befall the city that had for so many centuries stood as the unquestioned center of the Roman world, contributing to the broader sense of civilizational crisis and uncertainty that characterized Roman intellectual and religious life throughout this final tumultuous period of Western Roman imperial existence. The subsequent historical and cultural legacy that transformed the Vandal name into a general byword for senseless destructive behavior deserves careful critical examination, since this popular characterization, while reflecting genuine historical events discussed in the previous episode, considerably oversimplifies and, in various important respects, actively distorts the more complex historical reality of Vandal political and cultural behavior throughout their kingdom's actual historical existence. The specific origin of the term vandalism in its modern general usage traces to considerably later historical periods, particularly the 18th century, when European writers and intellectuals, working within a broader cultural and political context, quite removed from the actual 5th century Vandal kingdom, applied this specific historical name to characterize various forms of destructive behavior, particularly regarding the destruction of art and cultural monuments during periods of political revolution and social upheaval, creating a linguistic and cultural association that reflected these later writers' own contemporary political and cultural concerns considerably more than any genuinely accurate historical assessment of actual 5th century Vandal behavior and cultural practice. The actual archaeological and historical evidence regarding Vandal cultural and religious practice presents a considerably more nuanced picture than this later popular reputation suggests, with evidence indicating that Vandal rulers, whatever their genuine willingness to employ military force and extract wealth through conquest and raiding when politically or economically advantageous, generally maintained rather than systematically destroyed the existing urban infrastructure, administrative systems, and cultural institutions of the territories they conquered, recognizing the genuine practical value of these existing structures for their own continued political and economic administration of their new kingdom. The specific wealth that Vandal forces extracted through campaigns like the sack of Rome served clear and rational political and economic purposes within the broader context of Vandal kingdom building, funding continued military capability, supporting royal court display and political legitimacy, and contributing to the broader economic development of their North African capital at Carthage, representing calculated political and economic behavior considerably more consistent with rational state-building activity than with the popular image of mindless destruction that the later cultural application of the term vandalism would eventually and, in significant respects, unfairly attach to this historically significant kingdom. This gap between historical reality and subsequent cultural reputation illustrates a broader pattern common throughout historical memory, in which specific dramatic events, particularly those involving military conquest of culturally significant and symbolically important locations like Rome itself, can generate lasting cultural and linguistic legacies that considerably oversimplify and, in various respects, actively distort the fuller and more complex historical reality of the peoples and events being characterized. A pattern this broader podcast series has observed in various forms throughout its examination of numerous other ancient civilizations whose historical reputation, shaped disproportionately by their conflicts with more culturally dominant and historically better documented rival civilizations, often diverges considerably from the fuller and more balanced historical picture that careful modern historical and archaeological research increasingly reveals. The specific 18th century intellectual context in which the term vandalism achieved its modern general usage deserves additional examination, as this period's writers, working within the broader context of Enlightenment-era concerns regarding the preservation of classical art and culture, particularly amid the destruction associated with the French Revolution and its accompanying political upheaval, found in the distant, and by that point poorly understood historical Vandal kingdom, a convenient and evocative historical reference point for characterizing what they perceived as a genuinely alarming and culturally destructive contemporary phenomenon. Applying this ancient name to contemporary concerns in ways that reveal considerably more about 18th century European political and cultural anxieties than about the actual historical behavior of the 5th century kingdom, whose name they were appropriating for this specific rhetorical and political purpose. Modern archaeological excavation throughout former Vandal North African territory has increasingly revealed physical evidence directly contradicting the popular image of systematic Vandal cultural destruction, with continued use and maintenance of existing Roman public buildings, ongoing production of mosaic artwork and other decorative arts, and general patterns of urban continuity rather than wholesale destruction characterizing the actual archaeological record of this period, providing modern historians with an increasingly solid evidentiary foundation for the more nuanced and historically accurate reassessment of Vandal civilization that this episode has worked to present. Vandal religious identity centered on their adherence to Arian Christianity, a specific theological tradition regarding the nature of Christ's relationship to God the Father that had been formally declared heretical by mainstream Catholic Christian orthodoxy following the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, creating a genuine and historically significant religious division between the ruling Vandal population and the predominantly Catholic Christian population of their North African conquered territory throughout the kingdom's independent historical existence. This religious division generated genuine and sustained political and social tension throughout the Vandal kingdom's history, with various Vandal rulers pursuing different specific policies toward their Catholic Christian subjects, ranging from relatively tolerant coexistence to periods of more active persecution and pressure intended to encourage conversion to Arian Christianity, reflecting the genuine political challenge that religious division between ruling and subject populations represented throughout the kingdom's independent existence, a challenge that several Vandal rulers addressed with varying degrees of political sophistication and practical success. The broader social structure of Vandal North Africa involved a complex hierarchy in which the ruling Vandal warrior aristocracy occupied the most privileged social and political positions, while the considerably more numerous existing Romanized African population continued occupying various social and economic roles throughout the kingdom's territory, creating a genuinely complex multi-ethnic society in which political power rested primarily with the numerically smaller Vandal ruling population, while much of the kingdom's actual economic and administrative activity continued to depend substantially on the continued participation and cooperation of the existing Romanized population and their established administrative and economic expertise. Cultural blending between Germanic Vandal and Romanized African populations occurred gradually throughout the kingdom's history, with evidence including intermarriage between Vandal and Roman elite families, the continued use of Latin language and Roman administrative and legal conventions alongside Vandal Germanic cultural traditions, and broader patterns of cultural exchange and mutual influence that, while never eliminating the fundamental political and religious distinctions between these populations, nonetheless created a genuinely syncretic North African Vandal culture that differed meaningfully from both the earlier purely Roman provincial culture and the original Germanic tribal culture that the Vandals had carried with them throughout their long migration to North Africa. Daily life for the general population throughout Vandal North Africa likely continued in many practical respects along patterns already well established during the preceding centuries of Roman provincial administration, with agricultural production, urban commercial activity, and the broader economic and social structures of this historically prosperous North African territory continuing to function, adapted to the new political reality of Vandal rather than direct Roman imperial rule, but not necessarily experiencing the kind of comprehensive social and economic disruption that the later popular reputation for vandalism might otherwise suggest to those unfamiliar with the more nuanced historical reality of daily life throughout this genuinely complex and, in many practical respects, functionally stable kingdom. The specific persecution measures that certain Vandal rulers, particularly Huneric during his own subsequent reign following Gaisaric's death, directed against the Catholic Christian population of North Africa, deserve particular historical examination, as these documented episodes of religious pressure, including closure of Catholic churches, exile of Catholic clergy, and various forms of social and economic pressure intended to encourage conversion to Arian Christianity, represent genuine and historically significant religious conflict that considerably complicates any overly simplified narrative of straightforward peaceful coexistence between Vandal Arian and subject Catholic populations throughout the kingdom's independent historical existence. Contemporary Catholic religious writers, including the North African bishop Victor of Vita, whose historical account provides one of the most detailed surviving contemporary descriptions of Vandal religious policy, naturally present this persecution from a sympathetic Catholic perspective that emphasizes Vandal religious cruelty and injustice, requiring modern historians to read these accounts with appropriate critical awareness of their author's own religious and political perspective, even while recognizing that the genuine historical reality of religious tension and periodic persecution throughout the Vandal kingdom cannot be entirely dismissed or minimized simply because our primary surviving textual sources reflect a particular sympathetic Catholic viewpoint regarding these documented historical events. Beyond his significant military achievements already discussed in previous episodes, King Gaiseric demonstrated genuinely sophisticated diplomatic skill throughout his lengthy reign, successfully navigating a complex and often treacherous late Roman Mediterranean political landscape through careful alliance management, strategic marriage relationships, and calculated diplomatic engagement with various other barbarian kingdoms and remaining Roman political authorities throughout this politically fragmented and rapidly transforming late antique world. Gaiseric's diplomatic relationships with other Germanic barbarian kingdoms that had similarly established themselves within former Western Roman imperial territory, including the Visigothic kingdom in Spain and southern Gaul, and various other Germanic political entities throughout the fragmenting Western Roman world, involved a complex mixture of alliance, marriage relationships, and periodic conflict, reflecting the genuinely complicated and constantly shifting political landscape that characterized relationships among these various successor kingdoms throughout this transformative period of late Roman and early medieval European political development. The specific marriage alliance between Gaiseric's son and heir Huneric and a Visigothic princess, followed by subsequent complicated dynastic politics, including this marriage's eventual dissolution amid broader political tensions between these two kingdoms, illustrates the genuinely sophisticated but also genuinely precarious nature of dynastic marriage diplomacy throughout this period, in which such marriages could serve as genuine tools of political alliance building while also creating their own complex and potentially destabilizing political tensions when broader strategic circumstances between the involved kingdoms subsequently shifted. Gaiseric's relationship with the remaining Western Roman imperial authority itself proved particularly complex and diplomatically sophisticated, involving periods of formal treaty relationship and nominal political subordination, alongside periods of direct military conflict, including the sack of Rome itself discussed in Episode 5, reflecting Gaiserich's evident political calculation regarding when formal diplomatic accommodation versus direct military action best served Vandal kingdom interests at any given specific historical moment throughout his lengthy and politically sophisticated reign. This sustained pattern of careful diplomatic engagement, combined with the genuine military capability that previous episodes have discussed, allowed Geiserich to establish and maintain Vandal kingdom independence and regional influence throughout a period when numerous other barbarian political entities throughout the fragmenting Western Roman world proved considerably less successful at achieving comparable lasting political stability and independent kingdom consolidation, illustrating the genuine and historically significant political and diplomatic sophistication that this particular Vandal ruler brought to bear throughout his remarkably successful and historically consequential reign. The period of Gaiserich's later reign represented the genuine political, military, and economic zenith of the independent Vandal kingdom, with the various administrative, military, and diplomatic achievements discussed in previous episodes combining to create a genuinely stable and prosperous North African kingdom that successfully maintained its independence and regional influence throughout the final decades of Gaiserich's remarkably long reign. Vandal administrative development during this period involved the establishment of increasingly sophisticated governmental structures for managing the kingdom's substantial territorial holdings and diverse population, drawing significantly upon existing Roman administrative precedent and expertise, while adapting these structures to accommodate the specific political requirements of continued Vandal royal authority and the maintenance of the ruling Vandal population's privileged social and economic position throughout the kingdom's territory. The continued productivity of North African agricultural land, particularly the substantial grain production that had historically made this region one of the Roman Empire's most economically vital provincial territories, provided the Vandal kingdom with a genuinely secure and substantial economic foundation throughout this period of political stability, with this agricultural wealth combining with the continued revenue that Vandal control over Mediterranean trade routes and periodic naval raiding activity provided to create a genuinely prosperous kingdom economy throughout the height of Vandal political power and stability. Carthage itself, as the Vandal royal capital, continued developing as a genuinely significant urban centre throughout this period, with the city's substantial existing Roman architectural and infrastructure heritage providing Vandal rulers with an impressive capital befitting their kingdom's genuine regional political and economic significance. While Vandal royal court culture developed its own distinctive character, combining elements of Germanic warrior aristocratic tradition with the considerable Roman cultural and administrative sophistication that governing this historically Romanized territory naturally required and encouraged throughout the kingdom's independent political existence. This period of genuine Vandal kingdom stability and prosperity under Gaiserich's mature and experienced leadership would prove, in retrospect, to represent the high point of independent Vandal political achievement, with the kingdom's subsequent history following Gaiserich's eventual death increasingly characterized by the kind of internal political instability and gradual weakening that subsequent episodes of this series will examine in considerable detail, illustrating how thoroughly the kingdom's continued stability and success had depended upon Gaiserich's own exceptional and historically distinctive personal political and military leadership capability. The specific legal and administrative reforms that Geiserich implemented during this period of kingdom consolidation included the establishment of formal succession rules intended to prevent exactly the kind of dynastic conflict that had historically plagued many Germanic kingdoms during royal transitions, with Gaiseric specifically establishing a system of succession based on seniority among his male descendants, rather than strict primogeniture, a system intended to ensure that the most experienced and capable available family member would inherit royal authority, though this same system would, somewhat ironically, itself contribute to some of the succession complications that subsequent episodes will examine, illustrating the genuine difficulty of designing succession systems capable of reliably preventing political conflict across multiple generations of dynastic transition. The cultural and intellectual life of Vandal Carthage during this period of stability deserves specific mention, as the city continued serving as a significant center of Latin literary and educational activity, with various historical accounts documenting continued literary and scholarly production within Vandal territory, illustrating that Vandal rule, whatever its genuine political and religious tensions with the broader Catholic population, did not eliminate or fundamentally disrupt the sophisticated intellectual and cultural traditions that this historically significant North African Roman provincial territory had developed across the preceding centuries of Roman administration and cultural development. Following King Gaiseric's death in 477 AD, after his remarkably long and historically significant reign, the Vandal kingdom entered a period of gradually increasing internal political instability and weakening central royal authority that would, over the following several decades, substantially undermine the political and military strength that had characterized the kingdom throughout its earlier history under Gaiseric's exceptional leadership. Succession disputes and internal dynastic political tensions among Gaiseric's royal descendants created recurring political instability throughout this period, as different claimants and factions within the Vandal royal family competed for political authority and royal succession, a persistent vulnerability that, as this broader podcast series has observed throughout its examination of numerous other ancient and late antique kingdoms and empires, frequently proved genuinely decisive in undermining previously established political stability once the specific individual leadership that had originally achieved and maintained that stability was no longer present to manage these inherently challenging succession dynamics. The military capability that had been so central to Vandal kingdom power throughout Gaiseric's reign appears to have gradually declined during this subsequent period, with various historical accounts suggesting reduced military effectiveness and readiness compared to the kingdom's earlier decades of sustained naval and military dominance throughout the Western Mediterranean, a decline that likely reflected both the specific loss of Gaiseric's exceptional personal military leadership and broader patterns of gradual military and administrative complacency that frequently affect established political and military systems once the original urgency and existential pressure that drove their initial development and effectiveness gradually diminished across subsequent generations of more secure and settled political existence. Renewed tension and periodic open rebellion from Berber populations throughout North African territories bordering or, in some cases, previously incorporated within Vandal kingdom territory, created additional security challenges during this period, as these indigenous North African populations, whose relationship with successive Roman and then Vandal political authority had always involved elements of both accommodation and periodic resistance, increasingly asserted independent political and military action as Vandal central authority and military capability showed signs of the broader weakening that this episode has already discussed. This combination of internal dynastic political instability, declining military capability, and renewed external security challenges from Berber populations created an increasingly fragile political and military situation throughout the Vandal kingdom during the decades following Gaiseric's death, establishing exactly the kind of accumulated internal vulnerability that would eventually prove historically decisive when the Vandal kingdom faced the far more serious and ultimately fatal external military challenge from the resurgent Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire that subsequent episodes of this series will examine in detail. Compounding the political and military difficulties discussed in the previous episode, the Vandal kingdom simultaneously experienced significant economic strain during this same critical period of gradual internal weakening, as various factors combined to undermine the substantial economic prosperity that had characterized the kingdom throughout the height of its power under Gaisaric's earlier and more stable leadership. The decline in Vandal naval capability and the reduced frequency and effectiveness of the naval raiding activity that had previously provided substantial supplementary royal revenue throughout the kingdom's earlier decades of Mediterranean naval dominance reduced this significant source of state income precisely during a period when the kingdom's broader political and military challenges were simultaneously increasing the practical need for reliable state revenue to fund continued military defense and administrative governance throughout the kingdom's territory. Periodic disruption to North African agricultural production, whether resulting from the renewed Berber tensions discussed in the previous episode, broader climatic factors affecting agricultural productivity throughout this period, or simply the cumulative effects of reduced administrative efficiency during this period of weakening central political authority, appears to have placed additional strain on the kingdom's economic foundation, further compounding the broader pattern of economic difficulty that historical sources suggest characterized this critical transitional period of gradual Vandal kingdom decline. The mounting costs of maintaining adequate military capability to address both internal Berber unrest and the increasingly apparent external threat that a resurgent Eastern Roman Empire represented, discussed in greater detail in the following episode, created genuine and increasing fiscal pressure on Vandal state finances, precisely as the kingdom's traditional revenue sources were experiencing the kind of decline already discussed throughout this episode, creating a genuinely difficult combination of increasing expenses and decreasing revenue that placed the Vandal kingdom in an increasingly precarious economic and, by direct extension, military and political position during these crucial final decades preceding their kingdom's ultimate historical collapse. Popular discontent among various segments of the kingdom's population, including both the ruling Vandal population increasingly concerned about their kingdom's apparent weakening position and the broader Romanized North African population, whose economic well-being depended substantially on continued political stability and effective governance, created additional social and political tension that further undermined the kind of unified political and social cohesion that effective response to the mounting external military threat facing the kingdom would ultimately require, setting the stage for the specific historical crisis that the following several episodes of this series will examine in considerable and historically decisive detail. The specific taxation and administrative burden that the kingdom's mounting fiscal difficulties placed upon ordinary agricultural producers and urban commercial populations throughout Vandal North Africa likely generated genuine practical hardship and resentment among these populations, whose continued economic productivity remained essential to overall kingdom prosperity, but who increasingly bore the practical burden of funding a royal government facing mounting military and administrative expenses without the benefit of the more abundant revenue streams that had characterized the kingdom's earlier and more prosperous decades under Gaisaric's original leadership. Trade relationships with other Mediterranean powers and trading partners may also have suffered during this period of gradual Vandal kingdom weakening, as the reduced military and naval capability discussed in previous episodes likely diminished the kingdom's practical ability to guarantee safe passage and favorable trading conditions for merchants operating within or through Vandal-controlled Mediterranean territory, potentially reducing the kingdom's role as a significant hub of Mediterranean commercial activity compared to the more commercially vibrant decades of the kingdom's earlier history under more stable and militarily capable royal leadership. The Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, under the ambitious Emperor Justinian I, who assumed the imperial throne in 527 AD, developed genuinely significant political and military ambitions regarding the reconquest of former Western Roman imperial territories that had fallen under the control of various Germanic barbarian kingdoms during the preceding century of Western Roman imperial collapse, with the Vandal kingdom in North Africa representing one of Justinian's earliest and, as subsequent episodes will demonstrate, most successful specific reconquest targets. Justinian's broader strategic vision explicitly aimed at restoring Roman imperial authority throughout the Mediterranean world, viewing the various barbarian successor kingdoms that had established themselves throughout former Western Roman territory as fundamentally illegitimate usurpers of rightful Roman imperial authority, rather than permanently established political entities whose independent existence deserved ongoing diplomatic recognition and accommodation. An ideological framework that provided Justinian with clear political and religious justification for the aggressive military reconquest campaigns that would characterize much of his lengthy and historically significant imperial reign. The specific selection of the Vandal kingdom as an initial target for this broader reconquest strategy reflected several practical strategic calculations, including the genuine internal political weakness and instability that the previous two episodes have documented, alongside the specific religious dimension of continued Vandal adherence to Arian rather than Catholic Christianity, providing Justinian with additional religious and ideological justification for military intervention framed partly as the liberation of oppressed Catholic populations from what official Byzantine political rhetoric characterized as illegitimate Arian heretical rule throughout North Africa. Justinian entrusted command of this crucial military campaign to Belisarius, one of the most historically significant and militarily capable generals of the entire late Roman and early Byzantine period, whose demonstrated military skill and strategic sophistication would prove genuinely decisive in the swift and historically remarkable military campaign that subsequent episodes of this series will examine in detail, reflecting Justinian's evident recognition that successful execution of this ambitious reconquest strategy required entrusting military command to a genuinely exceptional military leader capable of translating Justinian's broader strategic ambitions into actual battlefield success. The extensive military and naval preparations that Byzantine authorities undertook in advance of this campaign, including the assembly of a substantial invasion fleet, and army specifically prepared for the logistically challenging task of transporting and sustaining a major military campaign across the Mediterranean Sea to North African territory, reflected the genuine strategic seriousness and substantial resource commitment that Justinian's government invested in this campaign, illustrating that this reconquest effort represented a carefully planned and substantially resourced strategic initiative rather than an opportunistic or poorly prepared military adventure. Justinian's specific political and diplomatic preparation for this campaign included careful attention to broader Mediterranean political circumstances, including securing at least tacit cooperation or non-interference from other regional powers whose potential intervention might otherwise have complicated Byzantine military operations against the Vandal kingdom, illustrating the genuinely sophisticated broader strategic planning that accompanied this military campaign beyond the purely military dimensions of fleet and army preparation already discussed, reflecting Justinian's evident understanding that successful execution of this ambitious reconquest strategy required careful attention to the full range of political, diplomatic, and military factors that might influence the campaign's ultimate outcome. The specific timing of this Byzantine invasion, launched relatively soon after the political instability surrounding Gelimer's own recent seizure of the Vandal throne discussed in earlier episodes, may have reflected deliberate Byzantine strategic calculation regarding the genuine opportunity that this specific moment of Vandal internal political transition and consequent uncertainty represented, illustrating how carefully Byzantine political and military leadership monitored and sought to exploit the accumulated internal weaknesses that previous episodes of this series have documented throughout the preceding decades of gradual Vandal kingdom decline. The Byzantine military campaign against the Vandal kingdom, launched in 533 AD under Belisarius's command, achieved a genuinely remarkable and historically significant military success within a surprisingly compressed time frame, decisively ending Vandal political independence within less than a year of the campaign's initial launch. A swift collapse that illustrates just how substantially the internal weaknesses discussed in previous episodes had actually compromised Vandal kingdom military capability by this critical historical juncture. The initial major military engagement at Ad Decimum, fought near Carthage shortly after Belisarius's forces landed in North African territory, resulted in a decisive Byzantine victory over Vandal defensive forces, with Belisarius's forces successfully exploiting tactical and strategic advantages against a Vandal military response that historical accounts suggest was hampered by exactly the kind of internal political division and reduced military effectiveness that the previous episodes examining Vandal kingdom decline had already documented throughout the preceding decades of gradual internal weakening. Following this initial defeat, Belisarius's forces proceeded to capture Carthage itself with relatively limited additional resistance, achieving control over the Vandal royal capital and administrative centre in a manner that starkly illustrated the genuine collapse of effective Vandal military and administrative capability compared to the kingdom's earlier decades of demonstrated strength and resilience under Gaisaric's more capable leadership. The subsequent and genuinely decisive Battle of Tricamarum, fought later in 533 AD, resulted in another comprehensive Byzantine military victory that effectively eliminated remaining organized Vandal military resistance, with the Vandal king Gelimer, who had assumed the throne through a political coup against his predecessor shortly before this Byzantine invasion began, forced to flee into the North African interior before his eventual capture by Byzantine forces, marking the definitive and historically conclusive military end of independent Vandal political and military resistance throughout their former North African kingdom. The genuinely remarkable speed and completeness of this Vandal military collapse, achieved by Byzantine forces within less than a year, against a kingdom that had successfully maintained independent political existence for nearly a century since Gaisaric's original conquest of Carthage, provides one of history's clearest illustrations of how substantially accumulated internal political instability, economic weakness, and declining military capability can compromise even a previously formidable and historically successful kingdom's practical capacity for effective defense against a well-organized and adequately resourced external military challenge, regardless of that kingdom's genuine earlier historical achievements and military reputation. Gelimer's own specific circumstances deserve particular historical attention, as his accession to the Vandal throne, through what amounted to a political coup against his predecessor Hilderic, who had pursued a notably more conciliatory policy toward both the Byzantine Empire and the kingdom's Catholic population, may have provided Justinian with additional political and religious justification for military intervention, framing the Byzantine invasion partly as a response to this specific internal Vandal political disruption and the removal of a ruler who had maintained more cordial relations with Constantinople, illustrating how internal Vandal dynastic politics directly contributed to the specific timing and ideological framing of the external military challenge that would ultimately prove fatal to continued Vandal kingdom independence. The specific tactical elements of Belisarius's military campaign, including his careful management of supply lines, his cultivation of local North African support and information networks, and his evident tactical flexibility in adapting to specific battlefield circumstances at both Ad Decimum and Tricomarum reflect the genuine military sophistication that made Belisarius one of the most historically significant military commanders of the entire late Roman and early Byzantine period, with his success against the Vandals representing merely one of several major military achievements throughout his broader and historically significant military career, serving Justinian's ambitious imperial reconquest strategy. Following the decisive military defeats discussed in the previous episode, and the capture of King Gelimer, the Vandal kingdom's political and administrative structures were rapidly dismantled and incorporated into the broader administrative system of the Byzantine Empire, marking the definitive and historically conclusive end of Vandal political independence after nearly a century of established North African kingdom rule. Gelimer himself, following his capture, was transported to Constantinople, where he was displayed in a ceremonial triumph, celebrating Belisarius's and, by extension, Justinian's own imperial military achievement, a customary treatment of defeated enemy rulers that reflected established Roman and Byzantine imperial political tradition. Before Gelimer was ultimately permitted to live out his remaining years in a form of comfortable but politically powerless exile, a treatment that, while representing the definitive end of his political authority, avoided the more severe punishment that defeated rulers sometimes faced throughout ancient and late antique political practice. The substantial accumulated wealth of the Vandal royal treasury, including treasures that Vandal forces had originally acquired through the sack of Rome, discussed in Episode 5, was transported to Constantinople as war spoils, with some of these treasures, according to certain historical accounts, including objects originally looted from the Jerusalem temple that Roman forces had centuries earlier taken to Rome, subsequently returned to Jerusalem by Justinian's specific order, illustrating the genuinely long and complex historical chain of conquest and treasure appropriation that connected these various ancient and late antique political and military conflicts across many centuries of shared Mediterranean and Near Eastern history. The Vandal population itself faced a complex and varied set of subsequent historical fates following this final political collapse, with the specific ruling Vandal warrior aristocracy that had constituted the kingdom's political and military elite largely dispersed, with some individuals incorporated into Byzantine military service, while others faced exile or simply disappeared from subsequent historical record, while the broader general population, including both those of Germanic Vandal descent and the considerably more numerous Romanized African population who had lived under Vandal political authority, gradually became incorporated into the re-established Byzantine administrative and social system throughout the reconquered North African territory. This comprehensive dissolution of Vandal political, military and administrative structures within a remarkably compressed time frame following their final military defeat represents a genuinely striking historical example of how completely an established kingdom's specific political and social order can be dismantled once its military capacity for effective independent resistance has been decisively broken, with the specifically Vandal political and cultural identity that had characterized this kingdom throughout nearly a century of independent North African rule, essentially disappearing from active historical and cultural practice within just a few years of this final and historically decisive Byzantine military reconquest. The historical legacy of the Vandal kingdom presents a genuinely instructive and, in various important respects, historically underappreciated chapter of late antique Mediterranean history, particularly given how thoroughly the later cultural application of their name to general destructive behavior has historically obscured the more complex and genuinely significant historical reality of their actual political, military, and cultural achievement throughout nearly a century of independent North African kingdom rule. Consider the full arc of this remarkable and historically significant narrative one final time. A Germanic tribal people, driven from their original Central European homeland by the overwhelming pressure of Hunnic migration, undertook an extraordinary and genuinely difficult journey across the entire European continent, crossing the frozen Rhine River, surviving years of difficult migration through Gaul and Iberia, before achieving the historically remarkable accomplishment of crossing the Mediterranean Sea and conquering one of the ancient world's most historically significant cities in Carthage, establishing an independent kingdom that would successfully dominate Western Mediterranean naval power for several decades and, in one of history's most symbolically resonant military campaigns, successfully sacked Rome itself. This same civilization, having achieved such remarkable and historically significant accomplishment under Gaisaric's exceptional leadership, ultimately proved unable to sustain this success across subsequent generations, with internal dynastic political instability, declining military capability, and mounting economic strain progressively weakening the kingdom throughout the decades following Gaisaric's death, until this accumulated internal vulnerability, combined with the specific and historically decisive external challenge that Justinian's ambitious Byzantine reconquest strategy represented, resulted in the kingdom's genuinely swift and comprehensive collapse within less than a single year of concentrated Byzantine military campaigning. The broader historical lessons that Vandal civilization's remarkable rise and swift collapse continue to offer extend well beyond simple observations regarding this specific kingdom's particular historical trajectory. The Vandal experience illustrates with genuine clarity how thoroughly a kingdom's continued political and military success can depend upon the specific individual leadership capability of exceptional rulers like Gaiseric, and how quickly accumulated succession disputes, declining military readiness, and economic strain can compromise even a well-established and historically successful kingdom's practical capacity for effective defense, once these various internal vulnerabilities reach a critical accumulated threshold, particularly when confronted by a determined, well-resourced and skillfully led external military challenge of the kind that Justinian and Belisarius's Byzantine reconquest campaign specifically represented. Modern historians continue working to recover and properly contextualize the genuine historical significance of Vandal civilization, whose actual achievements in naval power, North African kingdom administration, and broader Mediterranean political influence deserve considerably more balanced historical recognition than their name's unfortunate subsequent linguistic association with senseless destruction might otherwise suggest to those unfamiliar with the fuller and more complex historical reality of this genuinely significant, late antique Germanic kingdom. The Vandals crossed an entire continent, conquered one of history's great cities, ruled the Western Mediterranean from the sea for the better part of a century, and ultimately vanished so completely from independent political existence that their name survives today primarily as an insult, rather than as the historically accurate designation of a genuinely accomplished, if ultimately impermanent, ancient Germanic kingdom whose full and fascinating story deserves to be remembered with considerably greater nuance and historical accuracy than popular cultural memory has generally afforded them across the many centuries since their kingdom's final and historically decisive Byzantine conquest. Consider, in this series' final reflection, the genuine historical irony embedded within the Vandal name's subsequent cultural fate. A people who successfully governed a substantial and genuinely prosperous North African kingdom for nearly a century, who maintained functioning administrative systems, supported continued literary and intellectual activity, and generally preserved rather than destroyed the existing infrastructure and cultural achievements of the territories they conquered, would nonetheless become permanently associated in subsequent European language and cultural memory with precisely the opposite qualities: mindless, purposeless destruction without any redeeming purpose or achievement. This gap between historical reality and lasting cultural reputations stands as one of history's more striking examples of how a single dramatic event, filtered through subsequent centuries of cultural retelling and reinterpretation, increasingly removed from genuine historical context, can permanently reshape how an entire people and civilization are remembered, regardless of the fuller and more accurate historical record that careful modern scholarship continues working to recover and properly contextualize. The specific archaeological and historical evidence that continues emerging from North African sites associated with the Vandal kingdom period increasingly supports this more nuanced and historically accurate picture, revealing continued urban development, ongoing artistic and architectural activity, and general patterns of cultural continuity rather than wholesale destruction throughout the actual century of independent Vandal political rule, providing modern historians with an increasingly detailed and evidence-based foundation for the kind of historical reassessment that this civilization's genuine achievements have long deserved but have only relatively recently begun to receive within broader popular historical understanding and appreciation. What ultimately remains of the Vandal kingdom exists today primarily in scattered archaeological remains throughout modern Tunisia and the broader former North African kingdom territory. In the historical accounts of both sympathetic and hostile contemporary observers, whose sometimes conflicting perspectives modern historians must carefully weigh and interpret, and, perhaps most ironically and enduringly, in the linguistic legacy of their own name, transformed by many subsequent centuries of European cultural and political development into a general term for destructive behavior that bears only limited genuine connection to the actual historical achievements and complex political reality of the genuine 5th century kingdom that once ruled the Western Mediterranean from their sophisticated and prosperous North African capital at Carthage. The Vandals deserve to be remembered not as history's mindless destroyers, but as remarkable survivors and genuine kingdom builders who travelled further, achieved more, and ultimately fell more swiftly and completely than almost any other Germanic people of their historically significant and transformative late antique era.